The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fleming ranch as Martha knelt beside the weathered headstone that marked her husband's final resting place. The granite was still cool from the night, and she traced the carved letters with fingers that had grown thin over the past 2 years of solitude. Thomas Fleming, beloved husband, devoted soldier, taken too soon by fever. A cloud of dust rose on the horizon, growing larger as 6 riders approached at a steady gallop. Martha pushed herself to her feet, brushing dirt from her worn black dress, and shielded her eyes against the glare. She recognized the lead rider immediately. Bull Morrison, the territory's most notorious land grabber, sat astride a massive bay stallion like a king surveying his domain. The riders pulled up 20 yards from where she stood, their horses snorting and pawing the dry earth. Morrison was a mountain of a man, his belly straining against a vest adorned with silver conchos, his face red from drink and desert sun. Behind him rode 5 younger men, all armed, all watching her with the predatory patience of wolves who had cornered easy prey. If you're listening from somewhere that land means everything to families, you understand what Martha felt watching these men eye her property like vultures. Drop a comment and tell me what country or state you're calling from, because I love hearing how these stories of standing up to bullies reach people everywhere. Morrison dismounted with deliberate slowness, his boots hitting the ground with the weight of a man accustomed to taking whatever he pleased. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat in a gesture that mocked politeness. "Name's Bull Morrison. I represent certain business interests with designs on this particular piece of real estate." Martha stood her ground, though her slight frame seemed fragile against the backdrop of vast sky and endless prairie. "This land belongs to my late husband's memory, Mr. Morrison. It's not for sale." The big man chuckled, a sound like grinding millstones. "See, that's where you're wrong, little lady. Your husband may have homesteaded this patch, but he's been in the ground near 2 years now. Time to face facts. A woman alone can't work a spread this size, can't defend it proper, can't make it pay." His men spread out in a loose semicircle, hands resting casual-like on their gun butts. Martha felt her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she kept her voice steady. "Thomas made me promise to keep this place. I intend to honor that promise." Morrison pulled a folded document from his vest pocket and shook it open with a sharp snap. "This here's a bill of sale, all legal and proper. Sign it, and I'll give you enough money to buy yourself a nice little cottage in town. Refuse, and well, accidents have a way of happening to folks who don't know when they're beaten." Martha's eyes never left his face as she spoke. "My husband fought for this country and earned this land with blood and sweat. I won't dishonor his sacrifice by handing it over to men who never worked an honest day." Bull's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. His massive hand shot out and grabbed the deed papers from her trembling fingers, crumpling them with deliberate menace. "Playing rancher, are we? You think because you can tend a few chickens and grow some scraggly vegetables that makes you a real homesteader?" Martha took a step back, but her voice remained calm. "My husband wouldn't want trouble, Mr. Morrison, but he taught me to finish what other people start." The threat in her words was quiet, almost gentle, but something in her tone made the youngest of Morrison's riders shift uncomfortably in his saddle. Bull himself paused, studying the woman before him with the wariness of a man who had learned to read danger in unexpected places. Then he threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing across the empty plains like the bark of a coyote. Bull Morrison's laughter died away as he gestured to his men with a sharp nod. "Boys, seems the lady needs a demonstration of how things work in the real world. Start with those fence posts over yonder." The riders spurred their horses toward the property line where Thomas Fleming had spent countless hours setting cedar posts in perfect alignment. Martha watched in growing horror as they produced sledgehammers and began smashing the careful work her husband had completed just months before his death. The sound of splintering would carried across the morning air like breaking bones. "Stop this," she called out, her voice carrying a tremor that seemed born of fear rather than fury. Those posts took Thomas weeks to set proper. Bull folded his massive arms across his chest, enjoying the spectacle. "Should have thought of that before you decided to play the stubborn widow, ma'am. Now you're learning what happens when folks don't listen to reason." 2 of the younger men had moved to the hand-pumped well that supplied the ranch house with fresh water. They overturned the wooden trough that Martha used to water her small herd of cattle, then began dismantling the pump mechanism with deliberate malice. Years of careful maintenance undone in minutes. Martha hurried toward the house, her movements quick but unsteady, like a woman pushed beyond her limits. She emerged moments later carrying an old Winchester rifle, the wood worn smooth by decades of use but the metal still gleaming with care. Her hands appeared to shake as she raised the weapon, and her voice wavered with what seemed like desperate bravado. "I'm warning you men to stop destroying my property. This rifle still shoots true, and I know how to use it." Bull's eyes lit up with cruel amusement as he approached her, his boots crunching on the gravel. He moved with the casual confidence of a man who had faced down countless frightened homesteaders and never met one with the backbone to follow through on their threats. "That old smoke pole probably hasn't been fired since your husband passed, lady. You probably can't even remember which end the bullet comes out of." Before Martha could react, his massive hand swept out and slapped the rifle from her grip. The weapon clattered to the ground, and Martha stumbled backward, her face showing the shock of a woman unaccustomed to violence. "Dried-up old bird trying to play soldier," Bull sneered. "Jake, Tommy, search the house proper. Find that deed and any other papers worth knowing about. Maybe she's got a strong box hidden somewhere with enough money to make this worth our while." The two youngest members of his gang dismounted and approached the modest ranch house with the eager brutality of men given permission to destroy. Through the open door, Martha could hear the sounds of her life being torn apart. Furniture overturned, dishes smashed, drawers pulled from their housings and dumped on the floor. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Most of those things can't be replaced. They're all I have left of Thomas." Bull lit a thick cigar and puffed smoke in her direction. "Should have considered that before you decided to make this difficult, Widow Fleming. A smart woman would have taken my generous offer and counted herself lucky." A particularly loud crash came from inside the house, followed by the tinkle of breaking glass. Tommy emerged from the doorway carrying the shattered remains of a picture frame, the photograph it had contained fluttering to the porch like a wounded bird. Martha's composure finally cracked. She rushed forward and dropped to her knees, gathering the pieces of broken glass and the torn photograph with trembling fingers. The image showed her and Thomas in younger days, both wearing military uniforms, standing before an American flag with rifles at their sides. Now, before I tell you what happened next, if you're enjoying this story of standing up to bullies who think they can take whatever they want, hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do, because we bring you tales of ordinary folks doing extraordinary things every week. Comment below and let me know what country you're watching from. I love seeing how stories about justice and standing your ground reach people all over the world. Tommy paused in his destruction, his young eyes studying the torn photograph with sudden interest. "Bull," he called out, "take a look at this picture. Something about them uniforms looks familiar." Bull glanced over with irritation. "What's got into you, boy? It's just some old soldier and his bride. Half the territory fought in some war or another." But Tommy was already shaking his head. "No, sir, look at the insignia. That's 3rd Infantry Regiment. My granddad served under their command during the Apache campaigns. He always said they had the finest marksmen in the whole territorial army." Bull snatched the torn photograph from Tommy's hands and studied it with growing impatience. "So the dead husband was a decent shot. Don't mean his widow inherited any of his skill. Women folk ain't built for fighting, especially old ones like this dried-up prune." Martha remained on her knees, seemingly focused on collecting every scrap of the destroyed photograph, but her eyes had gone very still. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thomas won the Territorial Shooting Championship 3 years running. He taught marksmanship to younger soldiers who went on to become legends themselves." Bull threw the photograph pieces into the dirt and ground them under his boot heel. "Ancient history, lady. Your husband's dead, his fighting days are over, and yours never started. Jake, find anything useful in there?" The man emerged from the house carrying a small wooden box. "Just some old letters and a few pieces of women's jewelry. Nothing worth much." Bull's patience was clearly wearing thin. The sun had climbed higher, and sweat stained his shirt despite the morning coolness. "All right, Widow Fleming, here's how this plays out. You've got until sunset to sign them papers and clear off this land. After dark, accidents start happening to lonely widows who don't know when they're beaten. Martha rose slowly to her feet, brushing dirt from her black dress. Her movements seemed frail, but there was something in her posture that hadn't been there before. A straightening of the spine, a squaring of the shoulders. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. Bull's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then tomorrow morning, the boys and me will be back to hold a proper funeral. Right next to your husband's grave. Real convenient like." The threat hung in the air like smoke from his cigar. Martha said nothing, but her pale eyes moved from man to man, cataloging faces, noting weapons, measuring distances with the unconscious precision of someone who had learned to assess tactical situations. Bull remounted his horse with satisfaction. "Think it over real careful, Widow Fleming. Some fights ain't worth having, and this here's one of them." The 6 riders turned their horses and galloped away, leaving Martha standing alone among the wreckage of her mourning, the torn pieces of her past scattered at her feet like fallen leaves. Martha waited until the dust from Bull Morrison's horses had settled completely before she moved. The silence that followed their departure was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the destroyed fence posts and the distant lowing of cattle who sensed something amiss. She walked slowly to where her husband's rifle lay in the dirt, picked it up with careful hands, and brushed away the grit that had accumulated on its stock. The weapon was heavier than she had pretended, more familiar in her grip than any tool she had ever owned. Thomas had given it to her on their wedding day, but it was far from the finest firearm she had ever handled. The ranch house felt different as she stepped through the doorway. The casual destruction wreaked by Bull's men had turned her sanctuary into a battlefield, but Martha moved through the debris with purpose. She righted a fallen chair, swept broken crockery into a pile, and slowly restored a semblance of order to the chaos. In the bedroom she had shared with Thomas, Martha knelt beside their marriage bed and worked her fingers along the floorboards until she found the one that yielded to pressure. The hidden compartment beneath had been Thomas's idea, a place to store valuables and important documents away from casual thieves or hostile visitors. The wooden chest inside was small but heavy, bound with brass corners that gleamed despite years in darkness. Martha lifted it with reverent care and set it on the bed, her fingers tracing the initials carved into its lid. TF and MD, intertwined with a rifle and a rose, the work of a soldier with time on his hands and love in his heart. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the tools of a life she had left behind when she married Thomas Fleming. Her fingers found the familiar weight of shooting metals first, gold and silver discs that caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. Territorial Champion, 1871 through 1876. Expert Marksman, United States Army. Distinguished Service, Apache Campaign. Beneath the medals lay a photograph she had not looked at in years. Herself at 25, standing with a group of soldiers before a distant mountain range. She wore a modified uniform, tailored to fit her smaller frame, but bearing the same insignia as the men around her. In her hands was a rifle unlike any other, custom-made by a gunsmith in Denver who understood that precision shooting required precision tools. The memories came flooding back like water through a broken dam. The long hours of practice that had turned her into something more than human when she held a rifle. The Apache Wars where her skill had saved entire companies of men. The competitions where crowds would gather to watch the woman who could put 6 shots through a silver dollar at 200 yards. Martha Donnelly had been her name then, before she became Martha Fleming. But the newspapers had called her something else. Deadeye Donnelly, the woman marksman whose reputation had spread from California to the Mississippi River. The soldier who had never missed a shot that mattered. At the bottom of the chest lay her true treasure. The custom rifle that had made her legend, its stock carved with intricate patterns that told the story of every important shot she had ever made. Thomas had begged her to destroy it when they married, to leave that life behind completely. Instead, she had hidden it away, unable to part with the weapon that had defined so much of her younger self. The rifle came to her hands like a living thing, its weight distributed perfectly, its balance flawless despite the years of storage. She worked the action with muscle memory that had never faded, the mechanical precision of a woman who had stripped and cleaned this weapon 1,000 times. A soft knock at the front door interrupted her reverie. Martha wrapped the rifle carefully and returned it to its hiding place. but she kept one of the medals in her pocket as she went to answer the summons. Tommy Morrison stood on her porch, hat in hand, his young face troubled by conflicting loyalties. He was barely 20, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested he had not yet learned to hide his thoughts behind a poker face. "Mrs. Fleming," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they were alone. "I hope you don't mind me coming back, but I had to warn you about something." Martha studied the young man carefully. He had his grandfather's eyes, she realized now, the same pale blue that she remembered from old photographs. "Come in, Tommy. I suspect we have things to discuss." The young man entered her home with obvious discomfort, taking in the damage his companions had caused with visible shame. "Ma'am, I want you to know I didn't break nothing personal. I may ride with Bull Morrison, but I ain't lost all sense of decency." Martha poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that had somehow survived the morning's destruction. "Tell me about your grandfather, Tommy. You mentioned he served in the 3rd Infantry." Tommy's face brightened despite his obvious worry. "Grandpa Jake was my hero, Mrs. Fleming. He used to tell me stories about the Apache campaigns, about the battles they fought to keep the territory safe for folks like us. He always said the 3rd Infantry had the finest marksmen in the whole army." "And did your grandfather ever mention Martha Donnelly?" The young man's cup stopped halfway to his lips. "Dead-Eye Donnelly?" "Lord, yes, ma'am. Grandpa said she was the finest shot he ever seen, man or woman. Said she could put a bullet anywhere she wanted from distances that would make grown men weep. He used to say she saved his life more than once during the fighting." Martha reached into her pocket and placed the gold medal on the table between them. The inscription was clear enough to read in the afternoon light. "Expert Marksman, M. Donnelly, 1874. Tommy stared at the medal as if it were a serpent that might strike. His face went pale, then flushed red, then pale again. "You're her," he whispered. "You're Martha Dead-Eye Donnelly." Martha corrected quietly. "I retired from that life when I married Thomas. But some things you never forget, Tommy Morrison." The young man's hands began to shake. "Ma'am, you got to understand, Bull don't know who you are. If he did, he never would have come here. Nobody in their right mind goes up against a legend like Dead-Eye Donnelly." Martha's eyes had changed, Tommy noticed. Where before they had seemed watery and weak, now they held the steady focus of a predator evaluating its prey. "Your boss made a mistake, son. He threatened my home and dishonored my husband's memory. In my day, such things required an answer." Tommy set down his coffee cup with trembling hands. "Mrs. Fleming, I'm begging you. My grandfather always said you never killed a man who didn't need killing, but he also said you never let an insult to your honor go unanswered. Bull's got 5 good men with him, and they're all handy with their guns." Martha rose and moved to the window that overlooked her husband's grave. The sun was sinking toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "My husband lies under that headstone because he caught fever nursing a neighbor's sick child. He was a good man, Tommy. A kind man who believed in helping folks and building something lasting." She turned back to face the young rider, and he saw something in her expression that made him understand why grown men had fled rather than face her in combat. "But I am not my husband," she continued in a voice like winter wind. "And some things are worth fighting for, no matter the odds." Tommy Morrison stood quickly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Mrs. Fleming, I can't be part of what's coming. My grandfather would rise from his grave if I lifted a hand against Dead-Eye Donnelly. Then ride away, son. Ride far and don't look back." But as Tommy reached the door, Martha called out to him one final time. "Tell me something, Tommy Morrison. Does your boss always keep his word when it comes to violent threats?" The young man's shoulders sagged with the weight of truth. "Yes, ma'am. Bull Morrison may be a lot of things, but he's never made a threat he didn't follow through on. If you're still here at sunset, he'll come back with killing on his mind." Martha nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already known. "Then I suppose we'll all learn tonight whether some reputations are deserved or just tall tales for entertaining grandchildren." After Tommy left, Martha returned to her bedroom and opened the hidden chest once more. This time, she removed the custom rifle and began the ritual she had performed countless times before important missions. She cleaned every component, checked every mechanism, and loaded precisely 6 rounds into the magazine. The woman who emerged from that bedroom was no longer the trembling widow who had begged Bull Morrison to spare her property. Martha Deadeye Donnelly had returned from retirement, and sunset was still hours away. The sun hung low on the western horizon when Bull Morrison returned to the Fleming Ranch, but this time he brought an army. 8 riders followed him through the gathering dusk, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth like distant thunder. Several of the men carried torches already lit against the coming darkness, the flames dancing in the evening breeze like demons eager for destruction. Martha stood on her front porch, no longer the trembling widow who had begged for mercy that morning. She held her custom rifle with the casual confidence of a woman who had carried such weapons for most of her adult life. Her posture was straight, her movements economical, her eyes steady as winter ice as she watched the riders approach. Bull dismounted with theatrical slowness, clearly enjoying what he assumed would be his final victory over the stubborn homesteader. "Well now, Widow Fleming, I see you decided to greet us proper-like. That's a fine-looking rifle you're holding there. Shame you won't have much use for it where you're going." The men behind him spread out in a rough semicircle, blocking any potential escape routes. They were a harder crew than the ones who had accompanied him that morning. These were fighters, men whose faces bore the scars of violence and whose hands rested easy on their weapons. Martha descended the porch steps with measured grace, her rifle held across her body in a position that suggested both readiness and restraint. "Mr. Morrison, I've been thinking about our conversation today. You mentioned that you're a sporting man, someone who appreciates a fair wager." Bull's eyebrows rose in surprise. He had expected tears, pleading, perhaps even an attempt to flee. This calm discussion of wagers was not part of his usual script. "I might be interested in a small flutter, Widow Fleming. What did you have in mind?" Martha gestured toward the barn where a weather vane in the shape of a running horse topped the peaked roof. The distance was easily 200 yards, a shot that would challenge even an experienced marksman in good light. In the gathering dusk, it would seem impossible to anyone who didn't understand the true extent of her abilities. "That weather vane has been spinning up there for 15 years, she said conversationally. "Thomas used to say it was the finest piece of metalwork in the territory. I propose a simple contest, Mr. Morrison. If I can hit that weather vane from here, you and your men ride away and never trouble me again." Bull's laughter boomed across the ranch yard, echoing off the barn walls and causing his horse to sidestep nervously. "Lady, that's near 200 yards in failing light. Even if you could see the blamed thing proper, hitting it would take more luck than skill. What happens when you miss?" "If I miss," Martha replied calmly, "I'll sign your papers and throw in my late husband's gold pieces for good measure. Every coin Thomas saved during his years of service." The offer was too good to refuse, and Bull knew it. Even if the widow managed to get close to the target, which seemed unlikely, the bet would still leave him with everything he wanted. He nodded slowly, his cruel smile spreading across his weathered features. "You got yourself a wager, Widow Fleming. Boys, spread out so you can all see this lady make a fool of herself." Martha raised her rifle with the fluid motion of someone who had performed the same action thousands of times. Her left foot shifted forward slightly, her body angling toward the target, her breathing becoming deep and controlled. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood military bearing. The weapon seemed to become an extension of her body as she brought it to her shoulder. Her right eye aligned with the custom sights Thomas had commissioned from a German optical craftsman, sights that could resolve targets at distances that would strain ordinary vision. Her breathing slowed to the rhythmic pattern she had learned during her earliest training. Bull and his men watched with the casual interest of spectators at a county fair. They were certain they were about to witness an embarrassing failure, the kind of humiliation that would make excellent telling around saloon tables for months to come. Martha's finger found the trigger with the same gentle precision a pianist might use to caress a beloved instrument. She felt the weapon's balance, compensated for the evening breeze, and calculated the trajectory with the unconscious skill of someone who had made similar shots under far more difficult circumstances. The rifle spoke with a sharp crack that echoed across the ranch like breaking timber. 200 yards away, the weather vane rang like a struck bell as the bullet caught it dead center, sending it spinning wildly on its pivot before settling into stillness. The silence that followed was profound. Bull's men stared at the distant barn as if they could make the impossible shot unhappen through sheer force of will. Several horses shied at the unexpected sound, and one of the torches dropped to the ground in a shower of sparks. Bull Morrison's face had gone pale, but his pride would not allow him to honor the wager without a fight. "Lucky shot," he said, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "Wind must have caught that bullet just right. Any fool can get lucky once." Martha lowered her rifle, but kept it ready across her body. "A wager is a wager, Mr. Morrison. You gave your word in front of witnesses." But Bull was already shaking his head, his desperation making him reckless. "One shot don't prove nothing, Widow Fleming. Hell, I could have made that shot myself with enough tries. You want to impress me? Let's make it interesting." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a silver dollar, holding it up so the dying light caught its surface. "This here's a silver cartwheel, fresh from the Denver Mint. I'll hold it right here against my chest, and if you can punch a hole through it from 100 yards without so much as scratching my hide, I'll not only leave you be, I'll pay you $100 for the privilege of watching the finest shooting I ever seen." Several of his men shifted uncomfortably. Even hardened gunfighters understood the difference between a lucky shot and the kind of supernatural skill required to thread such a needle. One of them, a grizzled veteran named Pete, leaned close to Bull's ear. "Boss, maybe we should just take the lady's word that she got lucky and collect our money. That was a hell of a shot, even if it was accidental." Bull shrugged him off with violent impatience. "I ain't backing down from no dried-up widow woman, Pete. She wants to play games, we'll play games." Martha studied the silver coin for a long moment, her pale eyes calculating angles and distances with the cold precision of an artillery officer ranging targets. "Mr. Morrison, I want to be very clear about the terms of this wager. If I put a bullet through that coin without harming you, you and your men leave my property immediately and never return." Bull's confidence was returning as he considered the impossibility of the shot he was demanding. "Lady, if you can put a bullet through this silver dollar from 100 yards without touching me, I'll deed you half the territory and throw in my best horse for good measure. Hell, I'll get down on my knees and kiss your feet." Martha paced off exactly 100 yards, her stride the precise measurement of a soldier who had learned to judge distances by instinct. When she reached the proper range, she turned and raised her rifle once more, this time with a deliberation that spoke of absolute certainty. Her stance shifted into the classic military position she had perfected during countless hours of practice on army ranges from California to Colorado. Left foot forward, body weight distributed evenly, right elbow positioned to provide maximum stability. The rifle became motionless in her hands, a precision instrument guided by a master craftsman. Bull held the silver dollar against his vest pocket, his arm extended from his body to provide the clearest possible target. Despite his bravado, sweat had begun to appear on his forehead. At this distance, he could see Martha's face clearly, and what he saw there was beginning to penetrate his wall of arrogant confidence. The woman aiming at him was no longer the frightened widow who had trembled before his threats. Her eyes held the steady focus of a predator that had never missed its prey. Her breathing was controlled, her movements economical, her entire bearing that of someone who had faced death many times and emerged victorious. Martha's finger tightened on the trigger with the same gentle pressure she had used to ring the weather vane. But this shot required a precision that pushed the boundaries of human capability. She had to account for the slight movement of Bull's hand, the evening breeze, the exact trajectory needed to punch through the coin without endangering the man holding it. The rifle fired with a crack that seemed to split the evening air. The silver dollar disappeared from Bull's fingers as if it had never existed, leaving him staring at his empty hand in stunned bewilderment. A metallic clink drew all eyes to the ground where the coin rolled in a lazy circle before settling in the dust. Tommy Morrison was the first to move. He dismounted and retrieved the silver dollar, holding it up so everyone could see the perfectly centered hole that had been punched through its heart. The bullet had passed cleanly through the metal without leaving so much as a rough edge, a feat that required not just exceptional marksmanship, but an understanding of ballistics that few men possessed. "Boss," Tommy whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "This here coin's been drilled clean through. Dead center, neat as you please." Bull stared at the holed silver dollar as if it were a snake that might strike him. His face had gone gray as old ashes, and his hands shook as he reached for his gun belt. The other men sat their horses like statues, afraid to move lest they draw the attention of the woman who had just demonstrated the kind of shooting skill that belonged in legend rather than reality. Martha lowered her rifle and looked directly into Bull Morrison's eyes. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect on battlefields where men's lives hung in the balance. 47 consecutive territorial shooting championships, Mr. Morrison. I never missed a shot that mattered, and I never let a threat to my home go unanswered. Your move. Bull Morrison stared at the whole silver dollar in Tommy's trembling hand, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The shot had been impossible, the kind of marksmanship that belonged in dime novels rather than the harsh reality of territorial disputes. Yet the evidence lay before him, undeniable and terrifying. His pride, however, was a beast that had never learned to bow before impossible odds. Bull's face flushed red as anger overcame his momentary fear, and his hand dropped to the grip of his Colt revolver with the desperate fury of a man who refused to accept defeat. Lucky shot won't save your land, you old witch, he snarled, his voice cracking with rage and desperation. I don't care if you can shoot the wings off a fly. There's 8 of us and 1 of you, and luck runs out eventually. Martha had been expecting this moment from the instant she agreed to the wager. Men like Bull Morrison didn't honor agreements when those agreements cost them everything they wanted. She was already moving as his gun cleared leather, diving behind the stone well that Thomas had built with his own hands 15 years earlier. Bull's first shot chipped stone from the well's rim, sending fragments spinning through the evening air. His men opened fire a heartbeat later, their muzzle flashes lighting up the gathering darkness like deadly fireflies. Lead bullets whined off the stone walls and buried themselves in the wooden bucket that had drawn water for countless peaceful mornings. Martha crouched behind her improvised fortress, her mind automatically cataloging the tactical situation with the cold precision of a veteran soldier. 8 men, spread in a rough semicircle, approximately 40 yards distance. Limited cover except for the barn and a few scattered fence posts. Failing light would work in her favor once she began moving. The custom rifle felt alive in her hands as she worked its action, chambering a fresh round with the mechanical efficiency that had been drilled into her during countless hours of military training. Unlike the desperate men firing wildly in her direction, Martha understood that ammunition was finite and every shot had to count. She rose just enough to acquire her first target, a bearded gunman who was standing fully exposed beside his horse, reloading his revolver with clumsy haste. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the man's weapon spun away from his suddenly nerveless fingers as her bullet shattered the cylinder and trigger guard without touching flesh. The wounded gunman screamed and clutched his stinging hand, blood flowing from minor cuts caused by metal fragments. He stumbled backward and fell, no longer a threat, but very much alive. Martha had not come here to murder, only to protect what was hers. Water barrel, she called out in a conversational tone that carried clearly across the ranch yard. Her second shot punched a neat hole through a wooden barrel that one of Bull's men was using for cover. Water began streaming out in a steady arc, and the gunman behind it scrambled for new shelter, realizing that his protection had become useless. Pete, the grizzled veteran who had warned Bull against continuing the confrontation, was beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. This wasn't a lucky widow getting in one good shot. This was a professional marksman with military training systematically dismantling their offensive capability. Bull, he shouted over the sporadic gunfire, this ain't some frightened homesteader we're facing. That woman's been trained to fight, and she's better at it than any of us. Bull's response was to empty his revolver in Martha's general direction, the bullets striking stone and dirt with wild inaccuracy. His desperation was making him sloppy, and Martha could hear the frustration in his voice as he cursed and fumbled for fresh ammunition. Fence post, she announced calmly. The wooden post exploding 6 inches from another gunman's head sent splinters flying like shrapnel. The man dropped his rifle and ran for the barn, abandoning any pretense of courage in favor of basic survival. Martha let him go. Men who ran away were no longer a threat to her or her property. Tommy Morrison had not fired a single shot since the engagement began. He sat his horse at the edge of the action, his revolver still holstered, his young face pale with the understanding that he was witnessing legend in action. His grandfather's stories had prepared him for Martha's reputation, but seeing Deadeye Donnelly work was like watching poetry written in gunpowder and lead. "Your hat, Bull," Martha called out. Bull ducked instinctively, but the bullet still creased the brim of his Stetson, removing a neat section of felt and the eagle feather he wore as decoration. The hat flew from his head and landed in the dirt, and Bull realized with growing horror that the woman behind the well was playing with him. She could have killed him easily, but instead she was demonstrating her superiority with surgical precision. The psychological effect was devastating. 3 of Bull's remaining men broke and ran, spurring their horses toward the darkness beyond the ranch boundaries. They had signed on to intimidate a helpless widow, not to face a legendary marksman who was obviously toying with them. Martha rose from behind the well and walked calmly toward the barn, her rifle held ready but not threatening. Her movements were fluid and confident, those of a soldier advancing across familiar terrain. Bull and his 2 remaining allies found themselves backing away from her steady approach, their weapons forgotten in their hands. Bull, Pete, and Jake had retreated to the barn's interior, using the thick wooden walls as shelter against Martha's uncanny accuracy. They huddled in the darkness among the hay bales and farm equipment, their earlier confidence replaced by the kind of fear that made men's hands shake and voices crack. "You boys picked the wrong widow to terrorize," Martha called from somewhere outside. The acoustics of the barn made it impossible to determine her exact location, and the 3 men found themselves jumping at shadows and pointing their guns at every creak of settling timber. Bull pressed his back against the barn wall, his breath coming in short gasps. The silver dollar with its perfect hole lay in the dirt outside, a testament to abilities that defied rational explanation. He was beginning to understand that he had challenged something beyond his comprehension, a force of nature disguised as a grieving widow. Martha's voice drifted through the darkness, calm and matter-of-fact. "I can see all 3 of you through the gaps in these old boards. Thomas always meant to replace them with tighter planking, but we never found the time. Lucky for me, he was always too busy with other projects." 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, each one precisely placed to eliminate cover without causing mortal injury. The first bullet splintered the wooden crate that Jake was hiding behind, sending him scrambling for new shelter. The second shot punched through the hay bale protecting Pete, filling the air with golden straws that drifted like snow in the dim light. The third shot shattered a lantern hanging near Bull's head, raining glass fragments down on his shoulders. Each shot had been a statement, a demonstration that their hiding places were illusions of safety rather than genuine protection. Martha could have killed any of them at any moment, but she was choosing restraint over vengeance, precision over slaughter. Jake broke first. He stumbled toward the barn door, his hands raised above his head, his voice cracking with terror. "I give up. Please don't shoot. I got a wife and babies at home." Martha allowed him to leave unmolested. She had no quarrel with men who acknowledged defeat and chose wisdom over pride. Her argument was with Bull Morrison and his refusal to honor agreements made before witnesses. Pete lasted another few minutes before his nerves shattered completely. The older gunfighter had faced dangerous men before, but he had never encountered anyone who could predict his movements and counter them with such devastating accuracy. He followed Jake into the night, leaving Bull Morrison alone with his rage and diminishing options. Bull found himself truly alone for the first time since arriving at the Fleming Ranch that morning. His gang had melted away like snow before a spring sun, his threats had proven empty, and his confidence had been systematically destroyed by a woman who shot like an angel of death. Martha's voice carried through the darkness one final time, soft but implacable as winter wind. "Mr. Morrison, you can come out now. Time we finish this conversation properly." Bull emerged from the barn with his hands empty, his earlier bravado replaced by the hollow-eyed look of a man who had glimpsed his own mortality. Martha stood 30 yards away, her rifle held casually but ready, her pale eyes reflecting the last traces of sunset like chips of ice. "You win, Widow Fleming," Bull said quietly. "Whatever you are, whoever you used to be, you're more than I bargained for. I'll leave your property be and never trouble you again." But Martha shook her head slowly, her expression sad but determined. "It's too late for that, Mr. Morrison. You threatened to burn me out and bury me next to my husband. You destroyed property that can't be replaced and dishonored the memory of a good man. Some insults require an answer, and some threats can't be taken back. The final confrontation was coming, Bull realized with growing dread. Whatever happened next would determine whether he rode away from the Fleming ranch or joined its previous owner in the family cemetery. Martha Deadeye Donnelly had returned from retirement, and she intended to finish what he had started. The silence that settled over the Fleming ranch was profound, broken only by the distant sound of retreating hoofbeats as the last of Bull's men disappeared into the gathering darkness. Martha stood 30 yards from the barn, her rifle held with casual readiness, her pale eyes fixed on the man who had brought violence to her peaceful home. Bull Morrison looked smaller now, diminished by the loss of his gang and the destruction of his carefully cultivated reputation. He stood with empty hands, his earlier bravado replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had finally encountered something beyond his ability to intimidate or overcome. Martha's voice carried clearly through the evening air, calm and implacable as winter wind. "Mr. Morrison, my husband was a man who believed in second chances and the better nature of human beings. He would have offered you mercy even after everything you've done today." Bull straightened slightly, hope flickering in his eyes like a candle flame in a drafty room. But Martha's next words extinguished that hope as efficiently as her bullets had scattered his men. "But I am not my husband," she continued in the same measured tone. "And I learned long ago that some men only understand one language. You threatened to burn my home and bury me beside Thomas. You destroyed property that held precious memories. You dishonored the sacrifice of a good man who died serving others." Bull's hand began moving toward his gun belt with the desperate slowness of a man who knew he was outclassed but refused to surrender without a fight. Martha watched the movement with the detached interest of a professional evaluating an opponent's capabilities. "I'm offering you the same chance Thomas would have given any man," she said quietly. "Walk away. Don't come back. Live with the knowledge that you were beaten by someone you underestimated, and let that be lesson enough." But Bull's pride was a poison that had infected his soul too deeply for wisdom to take root. His fingers closed around the grip of his revolver, and Martha saw in his eyes the kind of desperate fury that made men do foolish things in the face of certain death. "Can't do that, Widow Fleming. Word gets out that Bull Morrison was run off by some old woman, and I might as well hang up my guns permanent-like. Sometimes a man has to make a stand, even when he knows it ain't smart." Martha nodded with something that might have been respect. She understood the code that drove men like Bull Morrison, even as she prepared to enforce the consequences of that code. "Very well, Mr. Morrison. 20 paces, then. Like gentlemen used to settle their differences." The two adversaries walked slowly away from each other, counting off the traditional distance for a formal duel. Bull's movements were jerky with nervous energy, while Martha paced with the measured precision of a soldier who had performed similar rituals many times before. At 20 paces, they turned to face each other across the ranch yard. The last light of sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and gold, casting long shadows that stretched toward the distant mountains like grasping fingers. Bull drew first, his hand moving with the desperate speed of a man fighting for his very existence. The revolver cleared leather faster than most men could follow, muzzle swinging toward Martha's silhouette with practiced efficiency. But Martha's draw was something beyond mere speed. It was the fluid motion of someone who had trained until the weapon became an extension of her will, guided by muscle memory that had been honed through decades of life-or-death encounters. Her custom rifle seemed to materialize in her hands, rising to her shoulder with the inexorable certainty of gravity itself. The two shots sounded almost simultaneous, but Martha's bullet arrived first. It struck Bull's revolver precisely where the cylinder met the frame, transforming the weapon into twisted metal and sending it spinning from his suddenly nerveless fingers. The impact broke 2 bones in his gun hand and left him staring at bloody fingers that would never again hold a weapon with accuracy or strength. Bull's wild shot went high and wide, burying itself harmlessly in the barn roof 20 feet above Martha's head. He stood swaying on his feet, cradling his ruined hand against his chest, his face gray with shock and pain. Martha lowered her rifle and walked slowly toward the defeated land grabber. When she spoke, her voice held neither triumph nor cruelty, only the tired satisfaction of someone who had done what was necessary to protect what mattered most. "You'll live, Mr. Morrison, but you'll never handle a gun properly again. Consider it a mercy that I chose not to kill you outright. My husband would have approved of that decision, I think." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment of quiet reflection. A dozen riders emerged from the darkness, led by Sheriff Ben Hawkins, a grizzled lawman who had kept the peace in the territory for more than 20 years. Tommy Morrison rode beside him, his young face pale but determined. "Mrs. Fleming," the sheriff called out as he dismounted. "Tommy here came and fetched me, said there might be trouble out this way." Looks like he was right about that. Martha set her rifle aside as the sheriff approached, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid any misunderstanding. "Sheriff Hawkins, Mr. Morrison and his associates attempted to force me from my property using threats of violence and destruction. When I refused to surrender my legal claim to this land, they resorted to armed assault." The sheriff's eyes took in the scattered evidence of the night's conflict. Bullet holes in fence posts, the destroyed well equipment, the whole silver dollar that still lay gleaming in the dirt. His gaze lingered longest on Bull Morrison's shattered gun hand and the twisted remains of what had once been a fine revolver. "Bull Morrison," the sheriff said formally, "you're under arrest for attempted armed robbery, destruction of private property, and assault with intent to commit bodily harm. Boys, get him bandaged up and ready for transport back to town." As his deputies moved to take Bull into custody, Sheriff Hawkins approached Martha with the respectful manner of a man who had heard certain stories and was beginning to believe they might be true. "Ma'am, I don't suppose you'd be willing to tell me your full name for my official report? Something about your shooting tonight has folks talking, and I get the feeling there's more to this story than meets the eye." Martha glanced at Tommy Morrison, who nodded encouragingly. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the gold medal she had shown the young man earlier, handing it to the sheriff with quiet dignity. Sheriff Hawkins examined the medal in the lamplight, his weathered features growing thoughtful as he read the inscription. "Martha Donnelly, expert marksman, United States Army, 1874. His eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Deadeye Donnelly," he whispered. "Lord Almighty, ma'am, I thought you were just a story old-timers told to impress their grandchildren." Martha smiled for the first time that day, an expression that transformed her austere features and revealed hints of the woman she had been before grief and solitude had marked her so deeply. "The stories are mostly true, Sheriff, though I suspect they've grown in the telling over the years." As Bull and his surviving men were loaded into a wagon for transport to the territorial prison, word of the night's events began to spread throughout the surrounding community. By dawn, a steady stream of neighbors had arrived at the Fleming Ranch, bringing tools and lumber to repair the damage that had been done. Martha found herself overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from people she barely knew. Families who had heard the legend of Deadeye Donnelly and wanted to shake the hand of a living piece of frontier history. Veterans who had served in campaigns where her reputation had preceded her. Young women who looked at her with something approaching awe, understanding that they were meeting someone who had proven that courage and skill knew no boundaries of gender or age. 3 weeks later, Martha stood beside her husband's grave as the sun set over the restored ranch. The fence posts had been rebuilt stronger than before, the well equipment replaced with newer and more efficient machinery. A small plaque had been mounted near the front gate, placed there by grateful neighbors who wanted to ensure that the Fleming Ranch would be remembered as a place where justice had been served and legends had proven true. The custom rifle rested in its case inside the house, cleaned and oiled but no longer needed for its original purpose. Martha had discovered something unexpected in the aftermath of the confrontation with Bull Morrison. Teaching young women the skills of marksmanship and self-defense had given her a new sense of purpose, a way to honor both her own abilities and Thomas's memory. She knelt beside the headstone and placed fresh wildflowers in the small vase she maintained there. "The land's safe, Thomas," she said quietly, "just like we promised each other it would be. The house is full of laughter again, and there are young folks learning that they don't have to be victims of men like Bull Morrison." A gentle breeze stirred the grass around the grave, carrying with it the sounds of cattle moving peacefully in the distance and the voices of her students practicing on the makeshift shooting range they had constructed behind the barn. Martha smiled as she rose to her feet, Understanding that Thomas would have approved of the way their quiet ranch had become a beacon of hope for others who needed to learn that they possessed more strength than they knew. If you've stayed with me through this entire tale of hidden strength and unexpected courage, I want to thank you for listening. Stories like Martha's remind us that legends aren't always found in history books, but sometimes live quietly among us until circumstances call them to action. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of ordinary folks who did extraordinary things when it mattered most. Share with me in the comments what struck you most about Martha's journey. And remember that sometimes the most unassuming people carry the greatest power to change the world around them. Until our next story together, may you find your own courage when life demands it most.